The city streets hummed with the evening buzz, headlights illuminating the wet pavement as a soft drizzle misted the air. Emily Thompson adjusted her scarf against a cool autumn breeze, her steps slow and deliberate as she navigated the bustling sidewalks after a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital. The weight of exhaustion pulled at her body, but it was the emotional fatigue that left her feeling hollow. At 28, Emily felt trapped in a monotonous cycle. Work, family dinners, and her mother's persistent reminders that time was running out for her to find a husband. "Emily, you're a wonderful nurse," her mother, Linda, would often say at their weekly dinners, between sips of tea and critiques of Emily's single life. "But you can't take care of patients forever and neglect yourself. You need to find someone. Settle down." The pressure grated on her nerves. She knew her mother meant well, but every reminder felt like a ticking clock. Tonight was no different. She sighed as she pictured the inevitable conversation awaiting her at home. Maybe she'd skip dinner this time and head straight to bed. Lost in thought, Emily's gaze flickered to a figure huddled in the shadows of a building's entrance. A man sat against the cold stone wall, shivering beneath his thin, tattered coat. His beard was overgrown, his clothes stained and worn, but it was his eyes that stopped her mid-step. Deep blue and filled with an aching loneliness, they reminded her of something she couldn't quite place, something that pulled at her instincts. She hesitated. After years of working in the hospital, she had grown used to seeing suffering in all its forms. But this man felt different, like someone who had once had a story worth telling. A story lost. Before she could think it through, her feet carried her toward him. "Excuse me, sir," Emily said softly, crouching to his level. "Are you all right?" The man looked up, startled by her presence. His gaze was wary guarded, but beneath the dirt and weariness, Emily could see flashes of a person who had once been much more. "I'm fine," he replied in a hoarse voice, his words sharp but weak. "You don't have to worry about me." Emily frowned, her nurse's intuition kicking in. "I'm Emily," she said, her tone warm. "May I ask your name?" He hesitated, eyes flicking between her and the street, as if weighing whether he could trust her. "Jason," he answered after a moment, his voice barely audible. "It's freezing out here," Emily continued gently. "Do you have anywhere to sleep tonight?" Jason shook his head and looked away, his silence speaking louder than words. Emily's heart clenched. Without giving herself time to second-guess, she made a decision she knew would raise questions later. "Come with me," she said, extending her hand. "I have a warm couch, clean clothes, and a hot meal. Just for tonight." "You shouldn't have to be out here." Jason's brows furrowed in confusion. "Why would you do that for me?" "You don't know me." "Because," Emily said with a soft smile, "we all deserve a little kindness from time to time." He stared at her hand for a long moment before taking it, his fingers cold and trembling. As he stood, his posture was stiff, and Emily noticed the slight limp in his step. What story lay hidden behind this man, she wondered. Neither of them realized that this act of kindness would set into motion a series of events that would test their courage, loyalty, and hearts. But as they walked toward her apartment under the dim glow of streetlights, one thing was certain. This night was only the beginning of something much larger than either of them could imagine.
Emily's apartment was a modest space on the third floor of a brick building tucked away on a quiet side street. The smell of fresh rain clung to their coats as she unlocked the door, flicking on the warm yellow light inside. Jason lingered in the entryway, his gaze scanning the small but cozy apartment. The soft cushions of a floral-patterned couch, the framed photos on the wall, and the faint scent of lavender candles gave the place a lived-in warmth that contrasted sharply with the harsh reality of the streets. "It's not much, but it's home," Emily said with a nervous smile, hanging her coat on the rack. Jason remained silent, visibly out of place. Sensing his discomfort, she gestured down the hallway. "The bathroom is over there. There's a hot shower and a clean towel. I'll leave some clothes outside the door, they might be a little big, but they'll be better than what you've got on now." Jason hesitated. "Emily, you don't have to do this." "I know I don't," she replied softly, meeting his gaze. But I want to. Go ahead. You'll feel better after a shower. Reluctantly, Jason nodded and disappeared down the hallway. The sound of running water filled the quiet apartment as Emily leaned against the kitchen counter, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her mind buzzed with a mixture of uncertainty and concern. What was she doing? She had just brought a complete stranger into her home, something she knew her mother would call reckless and foolish. But there was something about Jason that drew her in, something fragile but resilient. Despite his disheveled appearance, she could see glimpses of someone who had once had stability, dignity, and pride. Her instincts as a nurse told her he wasn't dangerous, he was just lost. Pushing those thoughts aside, Emily busied herself in the kitchen, preparing a pot of soup and assembling a plate of sandwiches. By the time Jason emerged from the bathroom, her doubts had momentarily faded. Emily almost didn't recognize him. His damp hair was combed back, and his beard was trimmed just enough to reveal a defined jawline. He wore her brother's old gray sweater and a pair of sweatpants that were slightly too long, but they made him look more put together. Cleaned up, Jason no longer looked like a man on the streets, he looked like someone who belonged in a life far removed from where she found him. Jason stood awkwardly by the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of the borrowed sweatpants. "Thank you," he said, his voice clearer now but still subdued. "I can't remember the last time I felt human." Emily's throat tightened, but she managed a warm smile. "Come on, dinner's ready. You must be starving." They ate mostly in silence, the clinking of spoons against bowls the only sound. But Emily couldn't help but notice the way Jason handled himself. His manners were impeccable. The way he carefully used the napkin and held the cutlery suggested someone with a refined upbringing. "May I ask how you ended up on the street?" Emily ventured cautiously. Jason paused, setting down his spoon. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he sighed, his gaze falling to the table. "It's a long story," he said quietly. "One I'm not ready to tell yet." Emily nodded, respecting his boundaries. "That's okay. You don't have to tell me anything you're not comfortable sharing." After dinner, Emily prepared the couch with clean sheets and a thick blanket. "You can stay here tonight," she said. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out what's next." Jason watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "Emily," he said softly, "why are you doing this? Aren't you afraid of me?" The question made her pause. She was surprised by her own answer. "No, I'm not afraid. I think you're a good person who's been through something difficult. And as for why, maybe it's because I know what it's like to feel stuck, to feel like you don't know where your life is going." Jason didn't reply, but his eyes held a depth of emotion that made Emily's heart ache. With that, she retreated to her room, closing the door behind her. She leaned against it for a moment, her mind racing. What was she doing? How would she explain this to her family? What if she was making a terrible mistake? As she slipped into bed, she couldn't shake the image of Jason's lost gaze or the way he had thanked her as if her kindness were a gift he hadn't received in years. There was a story hidden behind his eyes, and she wasn't sure why, but she felt compelled to uncover it. Little did she know, the decision she had made tonight would change the course of her life forever. The morning light seeped through the curtains of Emily's apartment, casting a soft golden glow on the walls. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, coaxing her out of her dreamless sleep. Groggy but curious, she slipped on a robe and shuffled into the kitchen, where the source of the smell caught her by surprise. Jason was standing by the stove, stirring a pan of scrambled eggs. The gray sweater hung loosely on his frame, and his hair was slightly tousled, giving him a softer, more relaxed appearance. When he noticed her, he gave a shy smile. "Morning," he said, placing a plate of eggs and toast on the counter. "I figured it was the least I could do after you saved me from freezing to death." Emily blinked, still adjusting to the sight of him in her kitchen, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "I didn't expect you to cook breakfast." Jason shrugged, leaning against the counter. "I've always liked cooking. I haven't had much of a chance to do it lately." His eyes clouded briefly, but he quickly shook it off. "I hope it's okay." "It's more than okay," Emily said, sitting down at the table and taking a bite. "Delicious, actually." Jason poured her a cup of coffee and sat across from her, fiddling with the handle of his mug. The air between them was warm, but a layer of uncertainty remained. "So," Emily began, setting down her fork. "What's your plan? Do you have anywhere to go?" Jason's shoulders tensed. "No. I've been bouncing from shelter to shelter, working odd jobs when I can. But it's hard to find steady work when you don't have an address or clean clothes." He paused, meeting her gaze. "I know this was supposed to be just one night. I don't want to overstay my welcome." Emily bit her lip, conflicted. Part of her knew that inviting him to stay longer would be risky, especially with her mother already breathing down her neck about her life choices. But another part of her, the part that had felt the pull of compassion when she saw him on the street, couldn't bear the thought of him leaving without help. "You don't have to leave yet," she said, surprising herself. "Stay for a few more days. We can figure things out together. I can help you update your resume, get you cleaned up, maybe even find a place for you to stay." Jason's eyes widened slightly. "Emily, you've already done more for me than anyone else has in a long time. Why would you do more?" "Because," she replied, "I want to. And because I think you deserve a second chance." Jason looked down at his coffee, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug. After a moment of silence, he nodded. "Okay. But I'm not staying for free. I'll find a way to contribute, cleaning, cooking, anything." Emily smiled. "Deal." Over the next few days, their tentative agreement transformed into a routine. Emily helped Jason create a resume, piecing together bits of his work history as he carefully dodged questions about his past. She took him shopping for clothes, paying out of pocket despite his protests. In return, Jason cooked meals, tidied up the apartment, and even fixed a leaky faucet in her bathroom. But it wasn't just the practical tasks that deepened their connection, it was the moments in between. They would sit on the couch in the evenings, sharing stories about their childhoods. Emily talked about growing up with an overbearing but loving mother, and Jason shared snippets of a childhood filled with music lessons, family dinners, and something he didn't quite name, loss. One evening, as they sat watching an old movie on TV, Jason turned to Emily, his expression serious. "I never thought I'd end up like this," he admitted. "Sleeping on park benches, living off charity. I used to have a life, a good one. But I made mistakes. Big ones." Emily placed her hand gently on his arm. "Everyone makes mistakes, Jason. What matters is what you do next." Jason swallowed hard, her words settling deep within him. "I don't think I've met anyone like you before, Emily. You actually care." Emily felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "Maybe you just needed someone to remind you of what you're capable of." Jason nodded slowly, as if her words were planting the seeds of a hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. But as the days passed, cracks began to form in the fragile sense of normalcy they had built. Every time Emily asked about his past, Jason skillfully deflected the conversation, and the weight of whatever he was hiding hung heavy between them. Emily's curiosity grew, but so did her instinct to protect him. Then, just as their new rhythm seemed almost comfortable, the doorbell rang one evening, cutting through the tranquility like a siren. Emily's heart dropped when she heard the familiar voice calling from the hallway. "Emily! It's your mother." Panic flashed across Jason's face. "Do you want me to hide?" "No," Emily said quickly, a plan forming in her mind. "Follow my lead. Please." Jason's confusion was clear, but he trusted her enough to nod. Emily opened the door to find Linda Thompson standing there, perfectly put together as always, with a curious and concerned expression. "Emily, you weren't answering my calls, so I thought I'd check in." Linda's eyes landed on Jason, and her brow lifted. "And who is this?" she asked, her tone somewhere between polite curiosity and suspicion. Emily's pulse raced. Without thinking, she blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "This is Jason. My fiancé." Linda's jaw dropped, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Jason, to his credit, didn't miss a beat. "Mrs. Thompson," he said smoothly, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." The silence stretched, thick with tension, as Emily's mother processed the unexpected announcement. "A fiancé?" Linda finally said, her voice rising slightly. How long has this been going on, and why haven't I heard about it? Emily forced a smile, praying that Jason would continue playing along. It's recent, Mom. We were waiting for the right time to tell you. Linda studied them for a long moment, her sharp gaze flicking between the two. Well, this is certainly a surprise, she said, her tone skeptical. I suppose you'll have to join us for dinner tomorrow night so the rest of the family can meet this mysterious man. Emily's heart pounded. Of course, she heard herself say, though panic gripped her chest. Linda finally nodded and left, leaving Emily and Jason standing in stunned silence. When the door clicked shut, Emily collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Jason sat beside her, his expression a mixture of confusion and amusement. Fiancé? He said, raising an eyebrow. That's a new one. I panicked, Emily groaned. She was about to start asking questions, and I didn't know what to say. Jason leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Well, this just got interesting. Emily looked up, her face still flushed. I'm sorry. You don't have to go through with this. I can call her and tell her the truth. Jason shook his head. No, it's okay. You've done a lot for me. The least I can do is help you survive one family dinner. You really don't have to. I want to, Jason interrupted, his voice firm but kind. We'll figure it out together. As the weight of her impulsive decision settled over her, Emily couldn't help but wonder how far this lie would take them and what it would cost them both. The next evening arrived faster than Emily would have liked. Her stomach twisted into knots as she and Jason walked up the stone pathway to her parents' elegant home, the soft glow of porch lights making the house feel more imposing than usual. She clutched Jason's arm tighter than necessary, and he glanced down at her with a reassuring smile. Relax, Jason whispered. We've got this. Easy for him to say, Emily thought, as they reached the front door. She took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. Moments later, Linda opened the door, dressed in a cream-colored blouse and pearls, her eyes lighting up with curiosity as she greeted them. Emily. Jason. Come in, come in. The warmth of the home enveloped them as they stepped inside. Emily immediately noticed her father, Robert Thompson, seated by the fireplace with a glass of scotch, and her older brother Michael, standing by the window, scrolling through his phone. Both men looked up when Emily and Jason entered. Dad, Michael, Emily said, forcing a smile. This is Jason. Robert set down his glass and approached with the same air of authority that had intimidated her as a child. He extended a firm handshake to Jason. Jason, is it? I hope you're treating my daughter well. Yes, sir, Jason replied confidently. Emily means everything to me. The sincerity in his voice startled Emily, and for a moment, she almost believed it wasn't an act. Michael was less warm, his eyes narrowing slightly as he sized up Jason. So, what do you do for a living, Jason? Emily stiffened, but Jason didn't miss a beat. I'm a writer, he said smoothly. I'm working on my second novel. The first one was published a few years ago. Michael raised an eyebrow. A writer, huh? That's different from the doctors and lawyers Mom usually had in mind for Emily. Michael, Linda chastised, giving him a look of disapproval. Let's not be rude. She turned to Jason with a warm smile. A writer is quite exciting, actually. I'm sure you have plenty of interesting stories to share. Jason flashed an easy smile. I suppose I do. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, the table adorned with candles, fine china, and the faint scent of rosemary from the roasted chicken. The conversation drifted between polite small talk and subtle interrogations, with Michael steering most of the questioning. How exactly did you two meet? He asked, leaning back in his chair and folding his arms. Emily opened her mouth, but Jason spoke first. We met at a coffee shop. I was writing, and Emily was on her break from the hospital. She spilled her coffee on me, actually, Jason said, chuckling as if it were a fond memory. Emily blinked, impressed by how effortlessly Jason lied. It was an embarrassing moment, she added, playing along. And then? Michael pressed. We started talking, Jason said, looking at Emily. His gaze was soft, and for a moment, the lie felt real. And I couldn't stop thinking about her. One conversation turned into another, and well, here we are. Linda sighed dreamily. It's like something out of a romance novel. Emily couldn't help but notice how easily Jason fit into the evening. He answered every question with charm, deflected Michael's jabs with grace, and even had her father chuckling by dessert. But beneath her relief was something deeper, a flutter of emotion she couldn't quite suppress. When dinner ended, Linda insisted they stay for coffee in the living room. Emily sat on the couch next to Jason, their knees brushing. She was painfully aware of the warmth of his body next to hers, and when their fingers accidentally touched, a spark shot through her. She quickly pulled her hand away, but Jason noticed. Their eyes met for a brief second, and her heart raced. It's just the act, she reminded herself. He's pretending. But the intensity in his gaze suggested otherwise. As they sipped their coffee, Linda brought up the inevitable topic. So, when's the wedding? Emily nearly choked on her drink. Mom, we haven't set a date yet, she said quickly. We want to take our time. Nonsense, Robert said. When you're sure about someone, there's no reason to wait. Jason placed a comforting hand on Emily's back. We want the wedding to be perfect, he said smoothly. And that takes time. Linda sighed but nodded. I suppose you're right. Just don't wait too long, I'm dying to plan a wedding. When the evening finally drew to a close, Linda kissed them both on the cheek at the door. I'm so happy for you, Emily. Jason seems like a wonderful man. As they walked down the driveway toward the car, the night air cool against their flushed faces, Emily let out a shaky breath. I can't believe that worked. Jason chuckled. You really thought I'd let you crash and burn in front of your family? Emily smiled despite herself. You were amazing back there. I don't know how you did it. Jason stopped walking and turned to face her. Because I care about you, Emily. Maybe more than I should. The air between them shifted, heavy with unspoken emotions. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Jason leaned down and gently pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't part of the plan, and it wasn't a kiss meant for show, it was soft, warm, and real. For a moment, the world melted away. When they finally pulled apart, Emily's breath hitched, and her mind spiraled. This wasn't supposed to happen. Jason was supposed to be a temporary solution, not someone who made her heart race. She started, but the words wouldn't come. Jason took a step back, his gaze clouded with uncertainty. I'm sorry, he said softly. I shouldn't have. No, Emily interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. It's okay. They stood there, the weight of the kiss hanging between them like a secret neither was ready to confront. As they drove back to her apartment in silence, Emily stared out the window, her mind a blur of conflicting emotions. The lines between their lie and reality had blurred, and she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. What she did know was that this was no longer just about fooling her family. She was falling for him. And it terrified her. The next morning, the golden light of dawn seeped into the apartment, but for Emily, there was no comfort in its warmth. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the events of the previous night replaying in her mind: the dinner, the kiss, the way Jason's hand lingered just a second too long on her back. She could still feel the electricity from his touch and hear the sincerity in his voice when he said he cared about her. She had promised herself that this was just a temporary arrangement, a simple act to please her family. But the line had been crossed, and now her emotions were tangled in a way she wasn't sure she could fix. A knock on her bedroom door pulled her from her thoughts. Emily? It's me, Jason's voice called softly. Her heart skipped a beat. Come in. Jason opened the door, stepping in cautiously as if he knew the weight of what hung between them. He was dressed in a plain t-shirt and jeans, his hair still damp from a shower. I made coffee, he said, holding up 2 mugs. Figured you could use some. Emily sat up and took the mug from him, avoiding his gaze. Thanks. Jason sat at the edge of her bed, the silence between them thick and awkward. After a few sips, he spoke. About last night. Emily stiffened, gripping her mug tighter. It was just the heat of the moment, she said quickly, trying to protect herself. We're under a lot of pressure, and things got confusing. We can pretend it didn't happen. Jason flinched, but he recovered quickly, setting his mug on the nightstand. Is that what you want? Emily forced a smile, even though her chest tightened painfully. It's what makes the most sense. We said this was temporary, right? Jason studied her, his expression unreadable. Right. He stood up, his movements stiff, and nodded. Okay. If that's what you want. But it wasn't what she wanted, not at all. The rest of the day passed in a haze of avoidance. Jason kept busy applying for jobs online, while Emily distracted herself with house chores and an overdue grocery run. They barely spoke, each retreating into their separate worlds, though they couldn't escape the tension building between them. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang, shattering the fragile quiet. Emily froze, dreading the possibility of another unexpected visit from her mother. But when she opened the door, it wasn't Linda, it was Michael, standing there with his usual skeptical expression. Michael, she said, surprised. What are you doing here? I was in the neighborhood, he replied, brushing past her to step inside. Thought I'd stop by to check on my little sister and meet her mysterious fiancé in a more casual setting. Panic flared in Emily's chest. Now's not really a good time, she said, but Michael was already making himself at home on the couch. Relax, he said, smirking. I'm just here for a friendly chat. Jason emerged from the bedroom, clearly having overheard the conversation. Michael, he said, nodding politely. Nice to see you again. Michael leaned back, crossing one leg over the other as he studied Jason. Likewise. Hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. Not at all, Jason said smoothly, though Emily could see the tension in his shoulders. The conversation began innocently enough, small talk about work, books, and the weather. But Michael's gaze never softened, and it didn't take long for him to dive into more personal territory. So, Jason, Michael said, swirling the coffee Emily had reluctantly handed him. Where's your family from? Jason hesitated. They're scattered. We don't keep in touch much. Michael nodded, clearly filing that piece of information away. Interesting. And what's the name of that novel you published a few years ago? Emily's breath hitched. She hadn't thought to ask Jason that when they came up with their backstory. Jason didn't miss a beat. It was called Whispers of the Forgotten. Self-published, but it did well locally. Michael raised an eyebrow, as if searching for cracks in Jason's story. I'll have to look it up sometime. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Emily couldn't take it anymore. Michael, she said, her voice sharper than intended. Why are you really here? Michael set his coffee cup down, leaning forward. Because something about this doesn't feel right. You've never hidden anything from me before, Emily. So why now? Why is this guy, who appeared out of nowhere, suddenly the love of your life? Jason's jaw tightened, but Emily spoke first. Michael, I don't owe you an explanation for my life. No, Michael said, his voice lowering, but I know you better than anyone. And I know when you're lying. He stood, towering over her. What are you hiding? Jason stood as well, positioning himself slightly in front of Emily. That's enough, Michael. Michael's gaze flicked to Jason. Are you protecting her or protecting yourself? Emily's fists clenched. Michael, leave. Now. Michael stared at her, searching her face for any sign of weakness, but eventually, he sighed and grabbed his coat. Fine. But don't think this is over. He shot Jason one last suspicious glance before walking out the door. The moment the door closed, Emily sank onto the couch, her heart racing. I'm sorry, she whispered. He's protective, and I've never lied to him like this before. Jason sat beside her, his expression a mixture of concern and guilt. Emily, maybe it's time we tell the truth. This lie is getting out of control. She shook her head, tears threatening to fall. I can't. Not yet. My family, they'll never understand why I brought a stranger into my life like this. My mother will think I'm reckless, and Michael will think I'm a fool. Jason reached for her hand, his thumb gently brushing against her skin. You're not a fool. You have more compassion and courage than anyone I've ever met. But hiding the truth won't make this easier. Emily looked at him, her heart aching. I don't want to lose you, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You won't, Jason said softly. I promise. But we can't keep pretending forever. The air between them was heavy, their emotions tangled in a web of lies, half-truths, and feelings neither of them could name. For a moment, Emily allowed herself to lean into Jason's embrace, her head resting against his chest as his arms wrapped around her. She knew he was right. The lie couldn't last forever. But admitting the truth meant confronting her feelings for him and the part of her that was afraid of what would happen when the facade fell apart. And deep down, she knew that moment was coming faster than either of them were ready for. That night, Emily tossed and turned in bed, the weight of the day pressing down on her like a storm cloud. Michael's accusations, Jason's comforting embrace, and her own growing feelings tangled together, making sleep impossible. Finally, at 2 a.m., she gave up, threw on a sweater, and walked quietly into the living room. To her surprise, Jason was already there, sitting by the window, the glow of the city lights casting soft shadows across his face. He didn't look up when she entered, his eyes fixed on the world beyond the glass. Couldn't sleep? He asked softly, sensing her presence. No, Emily replied, taking a seat on the couch. You either? Jason shook his head, his fingers drumming softly against the armrest. I've been thinking. About what? She asked, though she already knew. Jason finally turned to face her, his eyes filled with vulnerability. Us. This lie. And how much longer we can keep this up before it all blows up in our faces. Emily's throat tightened. She had been avoiding this conversation, hoping they could push it off just a little longer. But here they were, the truth sitting between them, waiting to be acknowledged. I don't want to lose you, Jason, she whispered, her voice breaking. He moved closer, their knees touching. You won't lose me, he said, his voice firm. But Emily, we're in too deep. Your brother knows something's off. Your family won't let this lie stay hidden forever. We have to face it before it destroys us. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. But what if facing it means losing everything? What if I lose you? Jason gently cupped her face, his touch warm and steady. Emily, you won't lose me. I'm here. But we need to stop pretending this is just about fooling your family. We need to be honest with them and with ourselves. The tears spilled over, and Emily leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. For a few moments, they stayed like that, wrapped in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. But then Jason pulled away, just enough to look her in the eyes. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Something I should have told you from the beginning. Emily wiped her tears, her breath hitching. What is it? Jason's gaze dropped to his hands, his fingers intertwining as if he were holding something fragile. I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always homeless. He took a shaky breath. I grew up in a wealthy family. My father, Alexander Parker, is a powerful businessman. But things fell apart when I tried to expose the illegal activities within our family's company. My father found out, and I had no choice but to run. I left behind everything: money, connections, and the life I thought I'd have. I didn't want to bring you into this mess. Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. Jason, why didn't you tell me? Because I was ashamed, he admitted. I didn't want you to see me as a failure. But when your brother started asking questions, I knew it was only a matter of time before you found out. Her heart ached for him, for the burden he had carried alone. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. You're not a failure, Jason. You're one of the bravest people I know. His eyes softened, and for a moment, they sat in silence, their hands intertwined. But the weight of what he had just revealed lingered, and Emily knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. You're saying that my brother's investigation might uncover your past, she said, her mind racing. Jason nodded. If Michael digs deeper, he'll find out who I really am. And when he does, your family will want answers. A knock at the door interrupted them, loud and urgent, making them both jump. Emily's heart pounded as she stood up. It's the middle of the night. Who could that be? Jason stood too, his body tense. Stay behind me, he said, moving cautiously toward the door. Emily's hands trembled as she watched Jason peek through the peephole. He sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. It's your brother. Michael? Emily rushed to the door, unlocking it and swinging it open. Michael stood in the hallway, his expression grim. His shirt was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept. We need to talk, he said, brushing past her into the apartment. His gaze landed on Jason, narrowing. Both of you. Emily closed the door and leaned against it, her pulse racing. Michael, what's going on? Michael pulled an envelope from his jacket and tossed it onto the coffee table. I did some digging, Emily. And I found this. Jason's breath hitched, and Emily hesitated before picking up the envelope. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out the documents inside. Her eyes scanned the pages, her heart sinking with each word. Newspaper clippings. Financial reports. Photos of Jason at black tie events with the Parker family. His real name, Jason Parker, printed clearly on the documents. Why didn't you tell me? Michael demanded, his voice filled with anger and betrayal. You're engaged to a man with a secret past, and you didn't think to mention it? I didn't know, Emily whispered, tears filling her eyes. But he did, Michael said, pointing at Jason. He's been lying to you, Emily. To all of us. Jason stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. I didn't lie to hurt her. I lied because I was trying to protect her. My past is complicated, and I didn't want to drag Emily into it. Michael scoffed. And now you have. Do you even know the danger you're putting her in? The Parkers aren't exactly known for forgiving betrayal. Emily's knees wobbled, and she sank onto the couch, her mind spinning. Michael, please. Jason's not a threat. Jason crouched in front of her, his hands on her knees. Emily, I never meant for any of this to happen. I care about you more than anything, and I don't want to lose you. But Michael's right, my family is dangerous, and if they find out where I am, things could get worse. Emily's tears spilled over, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then what do we do? Jason cupped her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. We tell the truth. To your family. To mine. No more running. Her heart thundered in her chest, but she nodded. Okay. Michael watched them with a mix of skepticism and concern. You'd better hope the truth is enough, Jason. Because if it's not, you'll have me to answer to. Jason stood and faced him. I understand. And I'll do whatever it takes to prove I'm not a threat to Emily or your family. Emily looked between them, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The truth was finally coming to light, and there was no turning back. But as she looked into Jason's eyes, she knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened next, they would face it together. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains of Emily's apartment, casting soft beams of light on the coffee table, where the evidence of Jason's past lay scattered. The reality of the previous night hit Emily like a tidal wave. Michael's accusations, Jason's confession, and the decision they had made to confront the truth all weighed heavily on her. She found Jason in the kitchen, quietly making coffee, his movements calm but distant. The tension in the air was suffocating. Did you sleep? Emily asked softly. Jason shook his head, not meeting her gaze. Not really. Too much to think about. He handed her a mug, their fingers brushing briefly. Me neither, Emily murmured. She set her coffee aside and leaned against the counter. Are you ready for this? Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. No. But I don't think I'll ever be ready. It's time. He finally looked at her, and despite the fear in his eyes, there was determination as well. "I just want you to know, no matter what happens, I'm glad I met you." The emotion in his voice broke something in Emily. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. "We'll get through this," she whispered. "Together." Jason nodded, but his grip on her lingered, as if he wasn't sure how long he'd be able to hold on. By noon, they were standing on the doorstep of the Thompson family home. Emily's stomach churned with nerves as she rang the doorbell, Jason's hand firmly clasping hers. Linda opened the door, her expression softening when she saw her daughter, but the moment her gaze landed on Jason, confusion flickered across her face. "Emily, Jason, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," Emily said, her voice firmer than she expected. Linda hesitated before stepping aside. "Of course. Come in." Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Robert sat in his usual chair by the fireplace, flipping through a newspaper, while Michael stood near the window with his arms crossed. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone gathered, the weight of anticipation pressing down on them. Emily squeezed Jason's hand before stepping forward. "There's something we need to tell you. Something important." Robert lowered his newspaper, his gaze shifting between his daughter and Jason. "Go on," he said, his tone cautious. Emily took a deep breath. "Jason isn't who he said he is. His real name is Jason Parker, and he's the son of Alexander Parker." Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. Linda's face drained of color, and Robert sat up straighter, his expression darkening. Michael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing he already knew. Jason stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't come here to deceive you. When Emily found me on the street, I was at the lowest point in my life. I had no intention of dragging her into my past. But she saved me, and I couldn't bring myself to leave. I'm sorry for lying, but I care about Emily more than anything. That's the truth." Linda's hand trembled as she brought it to her mouth. "Jason Parker, your father is Alexander Parker?" "Yes," Jason admitted, his voice quiet. "I left my family because of the illegal activities within the Parker Corporation. I exposed them, and my father tried to destroy me. I've been running ever since." Robert leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "And now you're here, with my daughter. What do you expect us to do with this information?" "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or permission," Jason said firmly. "I'm here because Emily deserves the truth. And I'll do whatever it takes to protect her." Linda looked at Emily, tears brimming in her eyes. "Emily, why didn't you tell us sooner?" "I didn't know," Emily said, her voice cracking. "Jason didn't tell me until last night. And even when I found out, I was scared. I didn't know how to face you." Linda stood, her gaze softening as she walked over to Emily and cupped her face in her hands. "Oh, my sweet girl," she whispered. "You've been carrying this alone." Emily's tears spilled over as she hugged her mother. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't want to disappoint you." "You could never disappoint me," Linda murmured. As they pulled apart, Robert cleared his throat, standing to address Jason. "So what happens now? Are you planning to run again, or are you going to stay and face the consequences of your choices?" Jason straightened, meeting Robert's gaze head-on. "I'm done running. I'm going to confront my family, deal with the fallout, and rebuild my life. But I want to do that with Emily if she'll have me." Everyone turned to Emily, who wiped her tears and stepped toward Jason. "I don't care about your past," she said. "I care about who you are now. And I want to be by your side." Jason's breath hitched, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he pulled her into a tight embrace, resting his forehead against hers. Michael cleared his throat, breaking the emotional moment. "So, what's the plan?" "Because if the Parkers find out Jason's back, they won't sit quietly." Jason nodded. "I'm meeting with my sister Sophie tomorrow. She's the only one in my family I trust. She's been trying to reach me ever since my father passed away. If anyone can help navigate this, it's her." Robert crossed his arms. "I don't trust the Parkers, but I trust my daughter. If she's willing to stand by you, then we will too. Jason's throat tightened. Thank you, sir. Linda wiped her tears and smiled faintly. You're part of this family now, Jason. Just don't give me any more surprises, okay? Jason chuckled softly. I'll try my best. Emily squeezed his hand, hope blooming in her chest. For the first time in weeks, the weight of their secret lifted, replaced by a fragile but powerful sense of possibility. As they left the Thompson house, Emily felt Jason's arm wrap around her shoulders, pulling her close. The future wasn't guaranteed, and there were still battles ahead, but for the first time, she believed they could face them together. And no matter what came next, they would no longer be hiding. The morning sun cast a soft golden glow across the cafe as Emily stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her thoughts lost in the whirlwind of the past few weeks. Across from her, Jason sat, scrolling through his phone while taking small sips of his espresso. The light chatter of patrons and the hum of the espresso machine created a comforting background noise. Today was the day he would meet his sister, Sophie, and confront the family he had been running from for so long. Emily felt the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them, though Jason was doing his best to appear calm. You're sure you're ready for this? Emily asked, her voice soft but steady. Jason put down his phone, reaching across the table to take her hand. I have to be. Sophie says things have changed since my father passed. Maybe it's time to see what those changes really mean. Emily squeezed his hand. Whatever happens, you're not facing this alone. Jason smiled, a real, genuine smile that made her heart swell. I know. And that's the only reason I have the courage to do this. The cafe door swung open, and a tall woman with flowing brunette hair entered. Her eyes scanned the room before landing on Jason, and a look of relief washed over her face. Sophie Parker, elegant yet approachable, walked quickly toward their table. Jason, she said, her voice breathless as she hugged him tightly. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I'm here, Jason said, his arms wrapped around his sister. Thanks for reaching out. Sophie pulled back, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. We have a lot to catch up on. She glanced at Emily and smiled warmly. And you must be Emily. Jason talks about you constantly. Emily blushed. It's nice to finally meet you. They sat together, and for the next hour, Sophie and Jason caught up, discussing the changes within the Parker family and the company. Emily listened quietly, offering silent support whenever Jason glanced her way. Sophie explained how the board of directors had shifted and how Jason's involvement in the company's downfall had led to long overdue reforms. We could use someone like you, Jason, Sophie said earnestly. Someone who actually cares about doing the right thing. Jason leaned back, exhaling deeply. I don't know if I'm ready to jump back into that world. You don't have to decide now, Sophie replied, her gaze kind but firm. Just know that you're welcome back and that I'm proud of you. After Sophie left, Emily and Jason remained in the cafe, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. What are you thinking? Emily asked, taking a sip of her now cold coffee. Jason stared out the window for a moment before turning to her. I think it's time to stop running. Not just for my family, but for my dreams too. He smiled softly. I'm going to write again. Not fiction this time, but a real story, our story. Emily's breath hitched. Our story? Yeah, Jason said, his eyes shining. How a stranger's kindness saved a man who'd lost everything. How that kindness turned into something bigger, hope, family, love. And how it led to something neither of us expected. Emily blinked back tears, her chest tightening with emotion. Jason, that sounds beautiful. He reached across the table and took her hand again, lacing their fingers together. It won't be perfect, and neither are we. But that's what makes it worth telling. Emily smiled through her tears, the warmth of his words filling her with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Then tell it. I'll be your biggest fan. 1 year later. The waves gently lapped against the shore as the sun set over the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The beach was quiet, save for the distant sound of seagulls and the soft laughter of a child playing in the sand. Emily sat on a blanket, watching Jason chase after little Alex, Sophie's son, who giggled as he dodged the waves. The sight filled her heart with a warmth she couldn't describe, a mixture of contentment and pride. Jason scooped Alex into his arms and twirled him around before setting him back down. As he walked back toward Emily, his hair tousled by the ocean breeze, she couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. He flopped down beside her on the blanket, his arm casually draping around her shoulders. "I think Alex wore me out," he said with a laugh. "You looked like you were having fun," Emily teased, leaning into him. "I was," Jason admitted. He gazed at her for a moment, his expression soft. "I can't believe how far we've come." Emily nodded, her heart swelling. "Me neither. But I'm glad we kept going." Jason pulled a familiar book from the bag beside them and held it up, his newly published memoir. "Kindness, Chaos, and Love, A Journey to Finding Home." "I thought I'd never finish it," Jason said, running his fingers over the cover. "But here we are." Emily smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's perfect." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the waves and the boy playing in the sand. "What's next for us?" Emily asked softly, her voice barely above the sound of the ocean. Jason kissed the top of her head and smiled. "Whatever we want. We've already survived the impossible. The rest is just an adventure waiting to happen." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily realized something profound. Their journey hadn't been easy, there had been heartbreak, lies, and truths that had shaken them to their cores. But in the end, they had built something real, something unshakable. A family. A home. And most importantly, a future filled with love. The waves crashed softly, and Emily closed her eyes, letting the sound of the ocean and Jason's steady presence anchor her to the moment. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she did know one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together.